Well, good morning. The text we're going to be looking at today picks up really right where we left off last week. This section that we're looking at in Exodus chapter 3 going into chapter 4, the conversation that Moses is having with the Lord actually sort of continues on. So we sort of stopped in the middle last week. So we're going to continue on, and just as a reminder of sort of the context of what's happening in the story. In chapter 3 of Exodus, God called out to Moses from the burning bush. We talked about that some last week, how it was, burning but not actually burning, on fire but not burning. So something that grabbed Moses' attention. He was drawn to it. From there, God told Moses that he had heard the cries of his people who were suffering as slaves in Egypt, and God was going to send Moses back to Egypt to rescue them. Now, Moses was immediately worried in the text that we looked at last week. He was worried that his own people weren't going to believe that God had sent him. And in response to Moses' question about how would they know that you sent me, God revealed his name to Moses. God said to him, "I am who I am. Tell them I am has sent you." I am is the covenant name of God. It's the name of his promise and his presence and his power. It's the assurance that God will be with his people. It's a promise of God's faithfulness. And it's the declaration of God's power to save. I am is the God who is with his people, who has always been with his people and always will be with his people. And so in that first part of their conversation, Moses has questions really about God. He says, what if people don't believe that you are the one who sent me? But in this next part of the conversation, Moses really has questions about himself. He says, well, what if people don't believe that I am the one that you've sent? So in essence, what Moses is asking is he's really asking the Lord, isn't there someone better that you could send? And so with that in mind, please follow along. In our Pew Bibles, we're on page 47. And I'll read Exodus chapter 4, verses 1 through 17. Then Moses answered, "But behold, they will not believe me or listen to my voice, for they will say, 'The Lord did not appear to you.' The Lord said to him, 'What is that in your hand?' He said, 'A staff.' And he said, 'Throw it on the ground.' So he threw it on the ground, and it became a serpent, and Moses ran from it. But the Lord said to Moses, 'Put out your hand and catch it by the tail.' So he put out his hand and caught it, and it became a staff in his hand. That they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has appeared to you." Again, the Lord said to him, "Put your hand inside your cloak." And he put his hand inside his cloak, and when he took it out, behold, his hand was leprous like snow. Then God said, "Put your hand back inside your cloak." So he put his hand back inside his cloak, and when he took it out, behold, it was restored like the rest of his flesh. If they will not believe you, God said, or listen to the first sign, they may believe the latter sign. If they will not believe even these two signs or listen to your voice, you shall take water from the Nile and pour it on the dry ground, and the water that you shall take from the Nile will become blood on the dry ground. But Moses said to the Lord, "Oh, my Lord, I am not eloquent, either in the past or since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and tongue." Then the Lord said to him, "Who has made man's mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf or seen or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with your mouth and will teach you what you shall speak." But he said, "Oh, my Lord, please send someone else." Then the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and he said, "Is there not Aaron, your brother, the Levite? I know that he can speak well. Behold, he is coming out to meet you, and when he sees you, he will be glad in his heart. You shall speak to him and put the words in his mouth, and I will be with your mouth and with his mouth, and will teach you both what to do. He shall speak for you to the people, and he shall be your mouth, and you shall be as God to him. And take in your hand this staff with which you shall do these things." Please pray with me. Father in heaven, we thank you for this, your word, and this time that we have together this morning. Father, we pray that you would speak to our hearts by the power of your Spirit. Give us ears to hear and hearts to believe. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen. So as we begin this morning, the question that I want to ask kind of for all of us is, have you ever felt completely inadequate for a task or a job or a responsibility? Have you ever felt yourself wondering kind of what Moses is thinking about here, thinking, well, isn't there somebody who's more qualified to be doing this? Isn't there somebody better who could be doing this? Now, many of you have heard me talk before about my son Finn and his early birth, and he was born at 25 weeks, and we spent 3.5 months in neonatal intensive care, and that's a whole other story. I've shared some of that before. I'm sure that I will again. It's sort of a big event in our lives, but what I want to really talk about is what happened next. The thing that happened next for me and for Liz. So for those first 109 days of Finn's life, he was connected to monitors that were always tracking his heartbeat and his oxygen level and all of these things. And there were doctors and there were nurses and there were respiratory therapists and occupational therapists and ophthalmologists and hematologists and just every specialty that you could think of, 24 hours a day, every single day. And then one day, 3.5 months later, we got to take him home, which was wonderful and terrifying, right? I mean, we get to this point where after receiving this constant professional round-the-clock care, all of a sudden, he's going to be sent home with these two overwhelmed and exhausted and terrified and unqualified parents. So many times we asked ourselves, who said that this was okay? Right? Who said we were qualified to take care of this baby? I mean, we didn't know what we were doing. We were nervous and we were unsure. And yet, we had the one thing that no one else on this earth has. Right? We're his parents. He belongs to us and we belong to him. And so ultimately, it's not really about being qualified. Right? It's about being called. We're responsible for our son because he's ours, because God has given him to us. And so we might not feel qualified, but we're still his parents. And as sure as God has given him to us, he will equip us and he will teach us how to care for him. And that's the tension that we see with Moses in this passage. God's called him to do something that he feels completely unqualified for. I mean, he's a shepherd. He spends his day guiding his sheep through the hills and the valleys of Midian. He knows that. He understands that. I mean, we talked about this a bit last week. It's been 40 years. I mean, his memories of Egypt are probably very distant and very faint. And what he knows now are sheep. He knows how to deal with sheep. He knows how to take care of sheep. He knows how to lead sheep. He doesn't really know how to lead people. He doesn't know what to do. He doesn't know what to say. He doesn't really know where to begin. And so it's in this place of inadequacy, in this place of uncertainty, that God reminds Moses of something very important. That because he is the God who saves, God always equips the ones he calls. Right? Because he is the God who saves, God will always equip the ones he calls. Now, Moses' first objection comes in the first verse we look at today. In verse 1, he says, "They will not believe me or listen to my voice." And again, we talked about some of this last week. We understand that Moses' hesitation is understandable because the last time he tried to help his people, it went really, really badly. Right? He tried to intervene between two Hebrews who were fighting, and one of them looks at him and says, "Well, who made you a prince and a judge over us?" In other words, this guy looked at Moses and said, "Who made you the boss of me?" He's like, "I don't have to listen to you." And so Moses desperately wants to know, what's going to be different this time? I mean, if I go back now, what's going to be different? And so God gives him 3 signs. The sign of the snake, the withered hand, and water to blood. Now, the function of a sign is to point to something greater. If I take Finn to Legoland, and we just walk up to the front of Legoland and we stand in front of the Legoland sign and we take a selfie and go, yeah, and then we leave and go home, would he be happy? Would that be a good, use of a day, that we just go and take a picture in front of the sign? No, the sign points to something. The sign is there so you know where Legoland is and you go into Legoland. We're going to take the Lord's Supper this morning. The Lord's Supper functions as a sign that points to what Jesus did on the cross. Signs point to something greater. And so in that same way, each of these signs that we see here, they point to something greater. So the snake was a common symbol of Egyptian power. On the crown of Pharaoh, there was this reared up snake right in the center. It looked like it was ready to strike. That was a sign of Pharaoh's power. And so by God taking Moses' staff, just his common, ordinary shepherd's staff, and turning it into a snake, and then grabbing it and turning it back into the staff, this sign demonstrates the power of God. The power of God that is greater than the power of Pharaoh. And then when Moses puts his hand into his cloak and it comes out leprous like snow, now in the Bible, leprosy refers to any number of skin diseases. So it can mean a lot of different things, but the thing that we know about these types of diseases is that in the Bible there was no known cure for any number of these diseases. And so people with leprosy, they were often driven into exile. They were cut off from their communities. What they had was contagious, and it was seen as not only unpleasant, something that could be spread, but it was something that would make you religiously and ceremonially unclean, and you'd be cut off from everyone else. And so by healing the leprosy on Moses' hand, what God is doing, what this sign is doing, is it's pointing to the power of God over the things that people can't control. A disease that you can't cure and you can't get rid of. God has power over that. And then the third sign, when God takes the water of the Nile and turns it into blood. Now this is the one sign that doesn't actually happen here. Probably most importantly because Moses isn't near the Nile. He's in Midian. So the other ones God can do right there on the spot and show him. Having shown him those two, he tells him, okay, here's this third one. If you need it, this is what's going to happen. That you can take water from the Nile and turn it into blood. And Moses would have understood right away the significance of that. Because the Nile is the source of life for Egypt. I mean, not only does it provide water for Egypt, but that water also brings fertility to the land. Their ability to grow crops, their ability to live in this place is because of the Nile. I mean, without the Nile, Egypt would be a barren desert. And so to destroy the Nile would be to destroy Egypt. And so taking the water of the Nile and turning it into blood, it demonstrates the power of God over life itself. Right? So God has power over the symbols of Egyptian power. God has power over the things we can't control. And he has power over life itself. And so to Moses' first objection, God provides these miraculous signs that point to the power of God. Not Moses' inadequacy, but God's power. God is greater than anything and anyone who would stand against his people. Because remember, these are signs not for Egypt. These are signs for God's people. Right? This is so that they would know that God is the one who has sent Moses. But now Moses has another question. In verse 10, he says, I'm not eloquent. I'm slow of speech and tongue. And so basically he's saying, God, you know I'm bad with words. Right? I'm not good at saying stuff to people about things. And so even with these great signs, I'm not going to know what to say. I'm not going to be able to explain what they mean. And so then God very graciously tells him, I will teach you what to say. But God isn't just promising to give Moses a good script, right? It's not just, hey, say these things exactly as I tell them to you and it'll be all right. What he says is, who has made man's mouth? And who has made him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? And so what God is saying here is that not only is he going to teach Moses what to say and give him the right words to say, but he's going to give his people ears to hear and to understand. God is going to handle both sides of this conversation. God reminds Moses that he is the maker of everyone and everything. So people hear and understand because God gives them ears to hear and hearts to understand. Many times in his ministry, Jesus said, "He who has ears, let him hear." And in Proverbs 20, verse 12, it says, "The hearing ear and the seeing eye, the Lord has made them both." God is the God over everything. So it's not just that Moses is going to know what to say, but God is going to make it effective into the ears of his people. Now, one of the other things that we notice here is that God doesn't actually disagree with Moses. He doesn't, this is similar to what we looked at last week. He doesn't try to pump him up and say, no, you're not a bad speaker. You're great. I've heard you. You're fantastic. He doesn't do that. God doesn't rebuke him, nor does he try to build up his self-esteem. He seems to, at least by his silence on the matter, agree that Moses brings up a good point. But he reminds Moses that this big thing that's about to happen, right, the deliverance of his people, that's not a thing that Moses is going to do. God is the one who's going to do that. And so if God can do that, if he can rescue his people from slavery, if he can deliver them out of Egypt, and if God can perform these miraculous signs that point to his power to save, then God can not only give Moses the right words to say, but he will ensure that the people understand him. The big theme that we see in all of this is that God uses the ordinary to do the extraordinary. Right? A humble, normal, ordinary shepherd staff, a common skin disease, regular water from the river Nile, and an ordinary shepherd who's bad with words, who's not good at talking to people. Great salvation doesn't come because any of these things. These are ordinary, simple, common things. But in the hands of the God who saves, he will do something extraordinary. God will use the ordinary to do the extraordinary. And so then Moses has one last objection. In verse 13, he says, "Oh, my Lord, please send someone else." And so finally at this point, we're told that the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses. So why? Why is that the last straw for God? Why is that the point at which the Lord gets angry? Up till now, God has been gracious and patient, and he's answered all of Moses' questions, all of his objections. He has supplied what he's needed. And so is it that God has just finally run out of patience? I mean, that seems a little out of character. A, for what we know of the Lord, who is steadfast and long-suffering and patient. But also, I don't think they've been talking all that long. Right? This isn't a long conversation where Moses has just been pleading with the Lord and no, but something happens. Considering that God has spent 40 years preparing Moses to lead his people, it seems out of character for the Lord to suddenly grow impatient. So what else is going on? Well, I think the clue to that is what Moses says to the Lord in verse 13. And if you do a quick translation analysis, and I've mentioned this before, this is a thing that any of us can do on a computer. You can go to someplace like BibleGateway.com and you just type in a verse and click and see it in all English translations, and it'll just throw up. And if you do that and you look at this verse in several different English translations, you'll see that there are a number of them that say something along the lines of, "Lord, send whomever you wish." And the best way to describe that is that that is a fairly passive-aggressive response from Moses. He's not just saying, "Lord, send someone else." It's actually the equivalent of saying, "Okay, fine, God, whatever you say." Right? It's sort of this dismissive and sort of disagreeable agreement. Imagine if you were having a disagreement with someone. What happens if you try to end that conversation by saying, "Okay, yeah, fine, whatever you say"? Right? I mean, husbands, is that a statement that will endear you to your wife? Or children, is that a response that's going to make your parents happy with you? If you just say, yeah, fine, whatever you say. No. It's a response that is dismissive and it's disrespectful. It's a way of saying, you know what, I'm going to go on record here and say, I think you're wrong, but I'm going to go ahead and let you be wrong. I'm going to agree with you, but not really. And if you're not convinced yet that Moses is being disrespectful when he says this, then let's look one more time at verse 13. And in our Bibles, how is Lord written in verse 13? When it says, "O Lord," is it written in all caps, or is it written in just capital L, small letters? Right? It's not written in the all caps. And if you remember last week, we talked about, I am, the covenant name of God, Yahweh, that when that's written in our English Bibles, it's written as the Lord in all caps, or sort of small caps is what we would call it, sort of large L and then small capital letters for the O-R-D. In fact, there's an example of it, what it looks like, just right below it in God's reply in the next verse, in verse 14. And if you look, beginning all the way back in verse 10, Moses starts calling God Lord. Not I am, not Yahweh, but he's using the word Adonai. And it's a common word that means Lord or Master. It's a word that's often used for God in the Old Testament. And yet in this context, it stands out because Moses has already asked God his name. And God has revealed his name, and that name brings with it these great promises and assurances that now that God is going to be with his people, he's going to do this thing. And after all of that, Moses decides to use a common title for God instead of God's name. In the midst of this intimate moment that Moses is having with the Lord, he uses, a distancing name for God. A way of kind of starting to subtly push God away. And so God is understandably angry. Right? Moses is questioning the Lord and kind of pushing him away a bit. And yet, even in that anger, God still stoops down. He condescends to accommodate Moses' needs. He tells him that his brother Aaron can be his spokesman. But Moses is still going to have to go and do everything he's called him to do. Aaron can be with him, but Aaron can't go for him. And so what we see unfolding here is this relationship between faith and obedience. In his mercy, God understands our weakness, and he condescends, he comes down, and he accommodates our limitations. And yet in his sovereign plan, God is never sidetracked or redirected. He's always moving forward with his plan of redemption. Moses is called to go, not because of what he is or what he is not, but because of who God is. And because he is the God who saves, God always equips the ones that he calls. Now, one of the things I was thinking about this week was sort of just my own sort of relationship to ministry. And, I can identify with Moses in this, because if I think all the way back, when I first started volunteering with a youth group at my church in Chattanooga, Tennessee, just out of college, it was because my roommate talked me into it. And I didn't want to do it. I was like, I don't want to do that. And he was like, no, I think we should. I think, we could help. And so he kind of drugged me along. And I started volunteering with the youth group at my church. And in about 6 months' time, I ended up becoming the youth director in that church, and then I stayed in that position for 9.5 years. Shortly after Liz and I got married, we started talking about full-time ministry. I'd been working part-time at that church now for several years. And from our own conversations, we realized I was eager to start working full-time at the church, and so I wrote up this job description, and I gave it to the elders, and I said, just hire me full-time to do this stuff. And their reply was they believed that I was called to ministry. And so they weren't going to give me a job in the church, but they were going to send me to seminary so I could be better prepared. And I didn't want to go to seminary. It's like, that's not what I want. I just want to do this job and get paid more for it. And they're like, no, you should go to seminary. And I was like, but people who go to seminary become pastors. And I didn't think that anyone would accept me as their pastor. Right? So when Moses is like, they're not going to accept me, that's what I felt. No one's going to accept me as their pastor. And the elders in my church sort of patiently met with me, encouraged me. I decided, okay, I'll apply. But when I applied to seminary, I was like, I'm not going to apply for a Master of Divinity. I'm going to go get like a 2-year youth ministry degree and like come back here and just do youth work. And again, my elders sort of pointed to the fact that, I had an undergraduate degree. I could do the academic work of the Master of Divinity. They're like, don't take a shortcut, like get the full degree. Like you can do the work, you ought to do the work. And I was like, okay, fine. Like I'll get the MDiv. I was like, but I'm not going to get ordained. I don't want to be ordained. As I got closer to graduation and I started applying for jobs, I started to realize, well, if you want a full-time job and you actually do then get this Master of Divinity, that most jobs are going to expect you to get ordained. And so I was like, oh, okay, I guess I need to get ordained. And I was like, but I don't want to preach. Like, I want to find a job where I don't have to preach. And then I got a job where I got ordained and I was expected to preach regularly. And the last holdout was that I said, and I said this a lot of times, I said, but I don't ever want to be a missionary or a church planter. Mainly, like, I don't want to have to like raise money. I don't want to have to like go and like raise support. I don't think I'd be any good at it. I don't think that there are people who would support me to be a missionary. And here we are. Ultimately, what I learned from all that was that if God was calling me to something, then he would provide everything that was needed. He provided for me to go to seminary. He equipped me with the degree and the training that I needed to become ordained. Along the way, he convinced me that this was actually his will and his call for my life. When he called Liz and me to be overseas missionaries, he provided all the financial and the prayer support that we needed. He actually taught me along the way that I'm not doing any of this, that he is. And so in other words, because he is the God who saves, God has equipped Liz and me for this work that he's called us to. And so what's the point of that story? Like, is it just that like, y'all should be more like me? Because like I did everything right? Like, no, not at all. In fact, at almost every turn, right, I wanted to go the other way. I was slow to listen. I was stubborn. I was slow to believe. And God has often provided despite my own stubbornness and to the great surprise of my doubts. And so is the point that, well, we should all just try to be more like Moses. And again, no, that's a bad takeaway because Moses kind of gets it wrong a lot. Moses doesn't do very well in this story. He argues with God. He seems somewhat moved by some pretty incredible signs of God's power. More than that, God has a very specific call for Moses' life and for Moses' ministry. And so none of us can do what Moses was called to do. That was his job. It's not ours. Our lives aren't the same as Moses's. Our calling is not going to be the same as his. Your calling is not going to be the same as mine. Because your life isn't the same as mine. We have different lives and we have different gifts and we have different callings and different responsibilities. But each of us is called to obedience before the Lord. If God is calling you to himself, then he's calling you to obey his commands and to trust in his word. But still, that's not the main point of this story because that is still, our obedience is still a response. It's what we do because of what God has done. But the one thing that is the same in my life, and the same in your life, and the same in this story, is the Lord. He's the one who is the same in this story and in our own stories. He's the one who's the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And so more than anything else, this is a story about faithfulness. Not about Moses' faithfulness, not about our own faithfulness, but God's faithfulness. The same God who called Moses from the burning bush is the God who called me into ministry, and he's the same God who is calling you to believe and to trust in him. The same God who promised to save his people is the God who sent his Son to seek and to save the lost. the one who sent his Son to save us. The same God who said to Moses, I will be with you, is the one who died and rose for us and said, I am with you always. When we started Exodus, I said what we would see in Exodus, and we'll see this again and again and again, is that what God promises in Exodus, what God promises to Moses, he fulfills in Jesus. God said he would save his people, and he has done it. And because he is the one who saves, God always, always equips the ones that he calls. Please pray with me.